If Ukraine does not survive, the United Nations will not survive. Have no illusions.
Good evening to everyone, and today I'm very happy to welcome you at our fourth lecture in a wartime lecture series in which we discuss the events and the consequences which the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine brought to us and the world with all the changes we live in now, and in which we reflect on the war and consequences of the war. This series is brought to you by Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, School for Policy Analysis, and Kyiv-Mohyla Alumni Association, and I'm Research Director of School for Policy Analysis. My name is Anna Osipchuk. And we're also very happy to have Justus Liebig University of Gießen and Eastern European Research Center at Gießen University, which are our partners in this series. And today I'm extremely happy and I'm actually very enthusiastic to welcome Archimandtрима Kирила Говоруна, who is a professor in ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at the University College Stockholm. Please, Kirill.
Thank you. First of all, many thanks for inviting me to the series, which is really important, and also thank you for introducing me to the distinguished public, which I hope will join us either for the broadcast or for the recording. The topic of my presentation will be deputinizing the Russian world, the Russian soul. And I'm going to talk about if you want, the cultural and even metaphysical dimension of this war, because indeed this war is hardly comprehensible without taking into consideration those dimensions. I'd like to start my presentation with exploring the concept of the Russian soul, which is in the title of my presentation. I believe that this concept per se expresses well and in an adequate way the key problem behind this war. And this problem is the civilizational exceptionalism, which drives the Russian leadership, inspires the Russian people to wage this war. They have an idea of a special mission in this world. I would articulate briefly this mission as to save the world from itself. Even by destroying this world. Well, it sounds paradoxical, but this is one of those paradoxes of the ideology that underpins this war. So essentially, it's a sort of exceptionalism when a special, exceptional mission is ascribed to what they call a civilization, the Russian civilization, this concept of civilization and exceptionalism coheres with the concept of the Russian soul, because, well, the Russian soul is, of course, it's a metaphor, but it's telling about the idea that the Russians are special. So they believe that they are special. You remember one of those very weird statements by the people from the Russian political establishment. I believe it was the former Minister of Culture of Russia, Medinsky, who mentioned that the Russians suggested that the Russians have a special DNA. So it's almost like they have a special soul, the Russian soul. And I should say that this concept is quite popular outside Russia as well. And many people, including intellectuals in the West, they accept this concept and they play with it and they they enjoy it somehow. So I believe this war is underpinned by a sort of messianic politics, messianic attitude to its role in the history for Russia. I would say that this kind of messianic exceptionalism is not something unusual, at least in the period before the modern ages. Like in the period of antiquity, in the period of Middle Ages, many nations believed about themselves that they are special and they have a special mission in the world. The difference between those messianic attitudes to themselves and modern Russia is that in modern Russia, this medieval messianism has survived the modernization. It resurfaced, essentially, it has resurfaced in the modern era in its kind of medieval form. That's why, well, in Russia they're talking about new Middle Ages. So a feature of this Middle Ages, of this new Middle Ages, is this messianic attitude towards a role in history and politics in the world affairs. So essentially, Russian is one of a few modern nationalisms that still is underpinned by this idea of a special mission, of a special role to be played in this world. In my presentation, I'd like to survey briefly the evolution of this messianism. And well, let me go back to the Middle Ages, to the emergence of the medieval state of Muscovy, which of course should not be called Rus, the name that is applicable to the medieval state with the capital in Kiev. Muscovy, that was actually the way how it called itself. It's a self designation of the state. Muscovy was one of a few medieval Slavic empires that claimed their succession to Byzantium or to the Roman Empire, because Byzantium was essentially an eastern part of the Roman Empire, and it perceived itself as a Roman Empire. So several medieval kingdoms in the Balkans emerged with the idea that they are succeeding the Roman Empire. The two most prominent kingdoms were the Bulgarian and the Serbian one. They emerged with the idea that they have succeeded the Roman Empire. They call themselves the kingdoms of like Serbs and Romans, with a clear idea that their ruler is now the successor to the Basilevses, to the Roman emperors. And they emerged and they retained the messianic idea behind the Byzantium, behind the Eastern Roman Empire. This messianic idea was pretty much pertinent to the Roman Empire, I would say, which after the conversion to Christianity in the 4th century, developed this idea that this kingdom is a reflection of the kingdom of God. This kingdom has a special mission in the world to save the world, which sounds similar to what I've described about Russia. So originally, this idea goes back to Byzantium. The difference is that Byzantium did not want to destroy the rest of the world to save it, unlike Russia, but rather to bring civilization, to bring Christianity to every corner of the world, and to actually, it has managed to do so by creating the world as we know now, to a great extent. And the same messianic idea was adopted by the stronger kingdoms that emerged in the 13th, 14th century in the Balkans, as I mentioned, the kingdoms of Bulgaria and Serbia. Muscovy was quite late in succeeding in this role, in this messianic role, and Muscovy actually just followed in the steps, followed the example of Bulgaria and Serbia in what the scholars call translatio imperii, or translation, or transition of the empire, or projection of the Roman Empire upon new kingdoms, upon new political entities. So Muscovy claimed a special role for itself in pursuing the mission of Byzantium. Among those three medieval kingdoms that claimed succession to the Eastern Roman Empire, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Russia, I believe only Serbia and Russia still have some kind of messianic ideology behind them. And this is essentially an imperial or neo-imperial ideology, which we can observe in the modern politics of Serbia, and to a great extent in the modern politics of Russia. Bulgaria is not so much affected by it. It's more like a normal country, especially after it entered the European Union, and does not feature at least as strongly as its counterparts in Serbia and in Russia, this messianic ideology. Following the examples of Bulgarian and Serbian rulers, the Moscow rulers, Muscovy rulers, actively borrowed from the depository of the Byzantine rites and ideologies. For example, when Ivan III decided to officially proclaim his grandson Dmitry as his successor, he crowned him following the Byzantine rite. Dmitry, however, did not succeed Ivan on the Moscow throne. This throne was taken by Ivan's son from Sofia, Basil III. And this Basil continued the policies of his father in promoting the Moscow Principality as a successor to the Byzantine Empire. He insisted to be addressed as Tsar. And actually, this is a very interesting term for our discussion. Tsar is a Slavicized version of Caesar, Caesaros, which was the title of the Roman emperors after Julius Caesar. And well, they transformed the Latin Caesarus or Greek Caesaros into Slavic Tsar. And originally, this term was coined in the Balkans to designate exactly the succession of the Balkan medieval states to the Byzantine Empire, and the Muscovites adopted actually this term for themselves quite late, as I mentioned in the case of Basil III. It's important to underline the role of the Church in supporting such political claims. Just as now the Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, supports the claims of the Kremlin's rulers, so it did centuries ago when this new ideology of exceptionalism emerged in Muscovy. The Church of Muscovy at the time supported wholeheartedly these claims of Muscovy for Tsardom, for succession to the Roman Empire as a new Christian empire. It's interesting that an important role was played in justifying these claims, was played by what used to be a free republic of Pskov. There were two free republics which were not under the Muscovy dominance for a long time. Novgorod and Pskov, they were really republics, even close to the modern sense. And it's interesting that after the Republic of Pskov was annexed by Basil, it became a stronghold of this new Muscovite ideology. Well, it's almost, if you want, it's very clear. Well, it's very close, I would say, speculate with Crimea, which used to be a part of Free Ukraine and now provides, this ideological justification for Putin's aggression somehow, ideological and in terms of messianic, of this messianic role. So a monk from Pskov named Filofey is considered to be one of the key figures in articulating this new imperial ideology of succession regarding Byzantium. For example, he wrote an epistle. He wrote actually several epistles to Basil himself and his officials. He argued that Moscow should be understood as the third Rome. For example, in his epistle to courtier Mikhail Misur Munechin, Filofey described Basil III as a ruler who, I quote him, in the entire world is the only Tsar for the Christians and the ruler of the holy gods' thrones, of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which emerged instead of the Roman and Constantinopolitan churches, and which exists in the God-saved city of Moscow. It is the only in the world that shines brighter than sun. All Christian kingdoms reached their end and came together in one single kingdom of our sovereign. According to the prophetic books, this is the Roman kingdom, because two Romes fell and the third one stands still, while there will be no fourth one. So this is a very densely packed message, which has very clear eschatological, metaphysical dimensions that claims essentially, on the one hand, the usual thing for the kingdoms at that time that claimed succession to the Roman Empire. But Filofey went further and he said that this is the last one. There will be another, there will be no other successor to the Roman Empire but Moscow. So in this claim, essentially Moscow made a step further than other medieval theocracies or other medieval kingdoms that claimed succession to the Roman Empire by saying that no, that will be the last one. No other kingdom will success of this kind will succeed Muscovy. Of course, the idea of Moscow as the third Rome was manipulative, because Constantinople, according to its own political ideology, was not regarded as a second, but as the new Rome. Therefore, if there is no second Rome, there shouldn't be a third Rome. And Constantinople stressed that no, we are not a second Rome to be succeeded, but by a third or fourth or whatever Romes. Nevertheless, it should be admitted that Constantinople eventually yielded to this imperial ideology of Moscow, even though it was almost like suicidal, almost like self-denying for Constantinople, and Constantinople accepted this Muscovite ideology through its church. For example, when the ecumenical patriarch Jeremiah II visited Moscow to confirm its autocephaly, he also reportedly confirmed the ideology of the Third Rome. In his address to the Tsar, according to the Muscovite sources at least, he stated, I quote him, "Since the old Rome fell because of the Apollinarian heresy, and the second Rome, which is Constantinople, is possessed by the godless Turks, thy great Russian Tsardom, pious Tsar, is the third Rome, and thou alone under heaven art called the Christian Tsar in the whole world for all Christians." So unfortunately, even Constantinople, the Church of Constantinople, confirmed the claims of Moscow to be the third Rome. So essentially, with the ideology of Moscow as the third Rome, we have a birth of the Russian exceptionalism, civilizational exceptionalism that still underlines, frames the current political ideology in Russia, as it used to frame the political ideology of the Russian Tsardom until the revolution, until the October Revolution, more or less. And well, after the October Revolution, it was transformed into something different, but still messianic, like to bring freedom to the peoples of the world through communist ideology. So, which was essentially a transformation of the original messianic ideology of the Third Rome, of the special mission that Russia was supposed to play. Unlike the imperial ideology, when Russia said that we are the protectors of the Christian people worldwide, that we are, they also developed this idea of katechon, the one who holds holds up, the one who actually or contains, the world from falling apart. Which has become a really very important part of the Russian imperial ideology. Even though they claim that it is a Byzantine idea, in Byzantium it was not so popular as it became in Moscow. And they believe that their Christianity, their version of Christianity, Orthodoxy, is the holder of the world, from falling apart, and Moscow played like a role of the container of this magic liquid that or portion that kept the world together. In the communist time, it was a transformation into something new. This ideology, messianic ideology, transformed in the communist ideology, which was promoted with the idea that we are saving the world again from itself, again by destroying this world, of course. And that's why the period of the Cold War, it was a war which presupposed the danger of the nuclear war, as we all know, and that was exactly the same influence of this destructive ideology of exceptionalism that first the Russian kingdom, then the communist Soviet Union promoted, and which the Putinist Russia continues to promote. Well, let's come back to the imperial, to the Tsardom of Muscovy. And I should say that the Moscow's political style appeared increasingly Byzantine at the time of adoption of this idea of Moscow as the Third Rome. And this Byzantine appearance applied to both rituals and symbols, including the symbols of political power. At the same time, the Moscow rulers, now called Tsars, often acted as essentially Mongolian Khans, because Muscovy was actually a vassal of the Mongolian state, and through the Mongolian state, it was a vassal of the Chinese Empire under the Yuan dynasty. And that's how Moscow adopted its political style from its Asian sovereigns, as insidious and cruel. The most notorious in this cruelty was, of course, the son of Basil III, the first Tsar, Ivan IV, who was nicknamed as Terrible. Ivan the Terrible preferred to appear and behave as a Byzantine Basileus. He even wanted to be anointed as a Basileus. However, this right was for the first time applied to his successor, Theodore I. As historians note, it is not only Ivan the Fourth, the Terrible, who should be called Terrible. His predecessors and some successors on the throne of Moscow deserve the same label. I believe that the tradition of terrible Tsars is a collateral effect of messianism. Essentially, if you are essentially a messiah on the throne, if you believe that you play a special political role in the world, then you are exempted from the rest of the rulers. You are allowed to do things which are not allowed for other rulers or other ordinary people. This actually exceptionalism empowers you to adopt policies which can be really cruel, which can be inhuman. That's exactly what happened with those messianic Tsars of Russia. Ivan IV was probably one of the most religiously kind of inspired and messianically disposed Therefore, he was also one of the cruelest rulers of Russia, because exactly this messianism he believed allowed him to do things which are unacceptable in the usual life. I believe that this is also an explanation to this terrible cruelty which the Russian army demonstrates in Ukraine, because they come with this messianic idea. We are special, we have a mission, and we are forgiven for many things because we are performing this mission, including tortures and all those cruelties and mass killings and rapes that the Russian soldiers commit on the Ukrainian soil. So I believe it's not explainable just by the natural cruelty of the Russians. It's not explainable by rationality, it's irrational, but it can be explained by this messianic attitude to themselves, to their role, to what they do. Well, I believe that messianism has inspired not only the Russian political culture, but also has contributed to the Russian culture as such. This culture is the soft power of the Russian exceptionalism and messianism, and these are not my words, but the words of Putin. Just a few days ago, on the 5th of September, Putin signed an interesting document, which is called the Concept of Humanitarian Policy of the Russian Federation Abroad, where this document essentially explains and suggests a program of the Russian cultural activities outside Russia. And as I said, it has been signed by Putin, therefore endorsed by him for implementation under the present circumstances. It's interesting that this document speaks about the spiritual and cultural fundament of the Russian Federation. So it's not just, it's a combination of two kind of aspects of the foundations of the Russian Federation. One aspect of one foundation is cultural, and another one is spiritual. This document names the following kind of cornerstones of the Russian cultural policies and of this foundation, like traditional values, Eurasianism, collectivism, and Russian culture. The Russian culture in this document is presented as an instrument of soft power. I quote this document literally. This instrument, among other things, I quote again, helps or facilitates the neutralization of the anti-Russian attitudes that have political and ideological origin, end of quote. Besides, the international cultural and humanitarian cooperation is called to facilitate favored conditions for the realization of foreign political tasks. This is a very important statement, which says essentially that Russian culture is an instrument of the Russian foreign politics. Which means that according to the Kremlin, the Russian culture is an instrument. It's not just a value in itself. It's an instrument to achieve some particular international goals, which are nowadays, given the circumstances of the war, is to increase this hegemony of Russia. Therefore, well, I believe this is a very important clarification regarding the discussions which are conducted nowadays about the cancel culture, regarding the Russian culture, whether the Russian culture should be canceled or not. I'm personally against any cancellation of culture. At the same time, this document clearly shows that the Russian culture has been hostaged, has been abused by the Russian government, by the Kremlin. It has been instrumentalized to pursue political goals, and this instrumentalization should be addressed by us. I mean, by people who make like judgments about this cancel culture, and I believe the judgments should take into consideration this instrumentalization and should be addressing or should be pursuing the neutralization of such instrumentalization of the Russian culture. Therefore, I would say that in some cases, this cancel culture can be justified. I'd like to bring two cases of the Russian messianic exceptionalism as reflected in the Russian culture. It means that the Russian culture is not just a victim of this instrumentalization that I mentioned. It's not just a hostage, but it's also a contributor to this messianic exceptionalism. And I would like to illustrate this point when the Russian culture cooperates and corroborates the main points of the Russian civilization exceptionalism. And those are just two cases, and it's not an exhaustive list of such cases. One case is the Slavophilic tradition that emerged in the 19th century and really was very influential in producing, the Russian culture. Probably one of the most famous Slavophile is Fyodor Dostoevsky, who also, well, a part of being a proponent of the Russian culture, and he has shaped the modern culture as it is, as it exists nowadays, and it is loved by many nowadays. At the same time, we should not forget that he was a proponent of the Russian exceptionalism to quite a radical extent, I would say, to the extent of speaking about even Russian God or Russian Christ. So for him, the Russian identity, the Russian exceptionalism were justified by God himself. And he expressed this justification by naming God as Russian, or naming Christ, Jesus Christ, as Russian. He, for example, used these phrases in his letter, private correspondence with Maykov, and I'm quoting his letter, which was sent in December 1868. An even more radical case of the cultural underpinning of the Russian civilization exceptionalism is Eurasianism. Well, nowadays we perceive Eurasia through Dugin, who is really the main speaker on behalf of Eurasianism at this stage. But this tradition goes back to the 19th century. Essentially, it's like a modification of this Slavophilic movement and Slavophilic ideology. And well, there were people not as crazy as Dugin, who were much more educated, much more reasonable than Dugin, who had contributed to Eurasianism in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. They actually contributed, they have contributed significantly to the evolution of the modern Russian culture, including people who also simultaneously have contributed to the so-called silver age of the Russian culture. So it's really, Eurasianism originally was really a cultural phenomenon that has contributed to the formation of modern Russian culture. And yet it was a political ideology, an ideology that stemmed from this ideology of the Moscowist Third Rome, from the special role that Russia is called to play by God himself, in the modern affairs, in the humankind. Eurasianism through people like Dugin, as I mentioned, it continues to underpin modern Putinism. So essentially, all those lines or threads within the Russian culture have contributed to the formation of this concept of the Russian soul as something unique, as something special, as something to be admired, to be to be appreciated. And it continues to underpin this concept of the Russian soul, continues to underpin this civilization exceptionalism that we are talking about. This exactly exceptionalism inspires Putinism. So what shall we do about this? Well, I answered to this question in the title of my lecture. We need to deputinize the Russian soul. Essentially, to deputinize the Russian soul means to make it stop to exist. The Russian soul needs to disappear in order to be saved. I mean that this idea of the special mission needs to be erased from the Russian psyche, from the Russian mentality. They need to adopt this idea that they should be acting as normal. They should be just one of those nations that just want to live in peace with one another. I would draw a parallel in this point with the history of the German psyche, which also had through its culture, great culture of the 19th century, and before that in the 18th century, that went back to, well, even further to the Middle Ages. The idea of greatness, of its special role to enlighten, the humankind, to provide the humankind with a clear direction where to go, how to develop. So Germany, before the World War II, had the same kind of civilizational exceptionalism, inspired by its culture, being driven by its culture to a great extent. And it ended up in the catastrophe of the World War II, of course. So after this catastrophe, the Germans learned to perceive themselves just as normal. After, of course, they repented for their sins and crimes that they had committed during the World War II. I think this is the path for the evolution of the Russian soul. It needs to disappear. It needs to evaporate. It needs to give way to the perception by the Russians of themselves as just another people, after they repent, of course, for what they've done, for all those crimes that they've committed. So for me, the example of the healing of the German soul is exactly applicable to how to heal this Russian soul from its exceptionalism and its its superiority, or the feeling of superiority. Also, I would call upon my colleagues in the West, intellectuals in the West, please stop speaking about the Russian soul. There is no such a thing. By speaking about this special soul, you spoil the Russians. You make them believe that they are indeed special. And this actually destroys them. And this makes them destroying others, like us Ukrainians. That's why it would be very helpful to urge the Russians to consider themselves as criminals now, at least those Russians who support the war, and they are majority, and then for all Russians to consider themselves as just as another people, as another normal people after they get repented about what they've done. I think that even the very Russian culture, I would suggest, needs to be revised, reconsidered, revisited in the terms of exceptionalism. Just like as the German culture was revisited, and really there was a very radical reassessment of the German culture regarding anti-Semitism, which very deeply was inside the German culture. Take Wagner, for example, who was a great composer and at the same time a great so to say anti-Semite. So the German culture was really reconsidered from the perspective of anti-Semitism after the Holocaust. I believe that the Russian culture needs to be reconsidered in the terms of exceptionalism, of this special way, special mission for the Russian people in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Because exactly this war has become possible because of this exceptionalism, because of this perception of itself as special, as bearers of a special mission. So that would be my call, my urge in the end of my presentation. And I think that's more or less what I wanted to share with you. And I will be very open to further discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we have a couple of questions, and I'll come to them later a bit. But please feel free. This is your opportunity to ask any questions you want. And but first, I have a couple of comments myself. And using this opportunity, I actually very much struck about, and I think it's very true, this last argument of yours that speaking about this particular Russian soul, we kind of emphasize its exceptionalism, and in a way, because what I think is also important here, that it kind of makes people who think that they have Russian soul proud, that it's so unfathomable, that it can't be understood by others, so that it can't be deconstructed, that it can't be unveiled, uncovered, that it's a secret, and whatever, and that exactly plays into this this game. And but what actually, while I was listening to you, I was struck a bit by several points, and I would go through them. First one is actually when we talk about this Russian world or whatever ideology, so it is really imperialism at the heart of it, or it is actually the messianic idea? Because while listening to you, I actually started thinking that probably it's not that much even about imperialism. Probably imperialism is the result of messianic idea as itself. And here, next point comes to me that somehow struck me, that the metaphor comparison to crusades, it was like a millennium ago, and of course we now have a totally different views, but when this quest that crusades went for, it's very much imaginable quest of returning and rebuilding, and returning Jerusalem, bringing our cradle back, or whatever. And it's very much, I think, I'm just struck by similarity. Probably Danny, it's a bit kind of a forceful, but of this track, for if you consider that Kiev could be seen as a kind of Jerusalem in a strange way for Russia, that is very much similar quest with exactly this very die-hard Crusades rhetoric, which is probably a literary exaggeration, but quite often cited that kill everyone, the God will choose his own from them. So that if you want to
very briefly comment on this, I really appreciate your observation. I think this is very true. The only thing that the idea of Kiev as the second Jerusalem comes not from the Russians, it comes from the Ukrainians. We like to call ourselves like Kiev is the second Jerusalem, and we essentially play into the hands of the Russians. They say, yes, we want the Jerusalem back because it is in the hands of the infidels, of the Saracens, just like in the Middle Ages. And for them, this is a holy war. This is a crusade to liberate this holy land, what they consider as the holy land, from the hands of the infidel Saracens. Yeah, so that's why I don't like, honestly, the concept of Kiev as second Jerusalem per se, even though I know that it is loved by many in Ukraine, but I think it can be dangerous, as any messianic idea can be dangerous in the present political circumstance.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with you. I mean, in a way, this thinking of something as second or third something is actually kind of a built-in historical mythology for probably some ulterior motives that one should be suspect of it, I think. But also I kind of struggle a bit with because I think it's very important that indeed and what you just said, that Russia see itself as and it's actually I was struck that I read it in some of the this occupants journals or whatever, that we are the domain of the Virgin Mary, and we and we have warriors, and we want to bring back the true Christian values, and they actually do not use word Christian, they rather use word traditional values or the true values, which is actually also struck me a bit because I struggle a lot of how much of Russian Orthodoxy have this Christianity in itself, and not, for example, some kind of a civic religion.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's again, thank you so much for calling the name civil religion, because I believe we are talking about civil religion indeed. Moreover, I would say that we are talking about political religion, and here I would like to differentiate. Well, speaking, in terms of the history of ideas, civil religion as such is not necessarily bad. Like, for example, we are talking about the American civil religion, which is quite harmless, and which really serves as a glue for the society. It has many rites, rituals, which are important, like, pledge of allegiance to the American flag and all those things, which are kind of okay. In Russia, we are dealing with something different. It's not just a civil religion. It's not just this social glue, which has an appearance of a religion. It's a religion, if you want, which has been called, at least in the European context, as political religion. I think one of those who called, who named this phenomenon as political religion was a German scholar, sociologist, who then immigrated to Chicago, to the United States, Voegelin, and the German scholarship exactly contributed to clarifying what is political religion. Political religion is essentially, it's a violent form of civil religion. It's a sort of a set of social and political rituals and measures that try to keep people together, but actually not by convincing those people to be together, but by forcing those people to be together. And it's coercive by its nature. And this is exactly what we are dealing with in the case of Russia. It's a civil religion which has been transformed into a very violent, coercive form of political religion, something that what communism was. The communist ideology was the same political religion in the Soviet Union, very violent, very coercive, and actually made people to subscribe to all those rituals, quasi-religious rituals, like venerating the relics of Lenin, and all those levels of initiation into the mystery of communism through pioneers, Komsomol members, and so forth. So it's another sort of political religion, and what we are dealing now with a different sort of political religion, which is Putinist. So Putin, together with the church, and that is where the church has played a crucial role, they have forged a special version, special edition of political religion, which is as violent as the Russian imperial ideology before the revolution, as violent as the communist ideology. And it comprises the elements of all those ideologies into a sort of political religion, which exactly envisages this war against Ukraine as a crusade.
Yeah, and just as a good illustration of what you are talking about, is this new cathedral, or not so new cathedral of
the military forces of Russia, exactly.
of military forces.
I call it the temple, the main temple of the Russian political religion.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look Orthodox Christian for me at all.
Really
But
eclectic. It's really eclectic, and I would say it's quite occultic, even as just as the Russian symbols of this war, those Zs and those Vs, which are kind of, they have very strange origins. It's even though they claim that they represent like the Russian traditional values or Russian orthodoxy, whatever, they have nothing to do with that. They are more like occultic, and it's a very strange spirituality which is embodied in that temple, as it is embodied, in those symbols of the war. And I think they have very remote relationship to the Orthodox tradition as such. On the contrary, I really like those pictures of the tanks which have been captured by the Ukrainians, and when they draw the crosses, the Cossack crosses on the top of the Zs and Bs, it's really symbolical for me, because it means essentially that, like the Christian tradition is restored in this case, without all those obscure allusions to something which is very kind of unthinkable, and I cannot understand the symbolism of the Russian war, which has nothing to do, I believe, with the Orthodox tradition.
Yeah, but then I actually have a question, and it's not probably it's a bit tangential to the topic, but if we are talking about like Deputinization of Russian soul, or liberation of from this messianism ideas and so on, then how we actually remove this civil religion or this occultic tradition from Russian Orthodox Church? How we kind of
by deconstructing it. I think we need to apply the instruments of of this post-structuralism and structuralism. We need to be like Derrida, in a sense, to deconstruct those ideas. And I did believe that those instruments of deconstruction could be helpful in order to disassemble this mythology, which drives the Russians in this war. We need to. It's an intellectual effort. It's something that the intellectuals can contribute to this war, and I believe this contribution is not less important than the contribution of the military forces of Ukraine, ZSU. Our effort is because this war is not just is fought not just by weapons, but primarily by ideas, and we need to address those ideas. When we neutralize the ideas, the wars will be impossible to continue to be repeated in the future. So we need to really join our efforts, and I believe that's what we are doing here in this meeting. We need to join our efforts to intellectually challenge and deconstruct the ideas, the ideologies that have led to this war in Russia.
I agree here, but I also have a bit of a problem, because what we are doing is a kind of what we are doing a bit from outside, because we are not kind of inside these structures or beliefs.
Surprisingly, we are quite insiders. Because, I mentioned one of those examples. For example, this Kyiv as the second Jerusalem, or this idea that you mentioned, that there's a special dominion of Theotokos, of Virgin Mary, that the Russians are trying to liberate. Essentially, we've adopted this idea that we are the dominion. I mean, Ukraine is the dominion of Theotokos, of Virgin Mary. So we use the same words, the same lexicon, vocabulary, if you want, with the Russians. The thing is, that's why we are the best fit the best prepared to deconstruct these ideas, because we are somehow insiders. But of course, this work needs to be done objectively, academically, scholarly. I think it would be dangerous to produce a sort of counter ideology, to produce an ideology which would be similar to the Russian ideology, but opposite to it. You understand?
I understand. Like the same by
the same, but with the opposite.
Formally the same, but
exactly.
different.
That would be a major danger for us. I think we shouldn't do that, and our academic work may help us to be objective, to keep some distance from those ideologies. That's why this work should be like surgical, academically, the work of deconstruction of those ideas. And I think we as people of the university, as academics, need, well, to apply the instruments of scholarship, proper scholarship to deconstruct those ideas.
I think we have a comment, and I think it's relevant to what we've been discussing with elements. I will read it. It's from Stefan Rodewold. I apologize if I pronounce the names not wrong. I agree very much, but would like to stress that it's about the reinvention of these elements. There was no necessity to redo them today. The choice could have been another one.
Yes, well, certainly the choice could have been very different. That's very true. Well, we should not forget that those ideas of the Slavophiles, the ideas of Eurasians, were relatively harmless for the entire 20th century up to our days. And all of a sudden they re-emerged and they created this combustible composition, ideological composition that blasted everything, that led to this war. It came very rapidly and very unexpectedly by many. Well, I should say, probably use this opportunity, it was not really unexpected for me, because I started warning about this ideology like 10 years ago and started ringing the bells. But at that time, it was really difficult to explain to anyone that it is dangerous. This ideology is dangerous, because people thought, well, it's just another special Russian idea. That's another manifestation of this mysterious Russian soul. But it was not. It was really very dangerous at the time already. So yes, well, it's not that those ideas led to the war automatically. No, they were used by the political powers, by the political will, to start this war, to wage this war. And the ideas per se, they are not the reason. They are the motivation. They explain the motivation, and they actually motivate people to act. But they are not per se the kind of the core, the decision-making agent of the war.
Now I think it's a good time for the question from Phil Murray, who asked, how do you assess Alexander Dugin's role in Russian ideology today? In the Western media, he's often portrayed as Putin's mastermind. I think you probably partly answered it, but please.
Yeah, at the same time, I would say it is an exaggeration to put too much weight to him. Dugi is a madman. He's a crazy person. Everyone in Russia knows that, including himself. And Dugin, well, he's portrayed sometimes as a philosopher, and they even invite him to speak as a philosopher, even to the American universities, which is really strange, because he's not an intellectual. He's he plays a role of an oracle, like a prophet. That's why sometimes, as with any oracle, whatever he says is not quite understandable what he means. So he's not really a philosopher. I would not exaggerate his role in Russia. Now they started exaggerating this role after his daughter was killed, and they started heroicizing his daughter and himself. But as a philosopher, as a thinker, I think he is believed to be more a thinker and a philosopher in the West than he is in Russia. Essentially, Dugin's system is very complicated and it's very controversial. It cannot drive masses. It can be like, exquisite, strange, ideological thing interesting for some intellectuals, but not really for masses. Masses don't read Dugin, and if they read him, they would not understand him. I would argue that he does not understand himself sometimes, what he is saying. While this ideology, which is driving this war, is really a mass ideology. I would also argue that Putin plays a role of a populist. And it's not an original role that he started playing as a president. Originally, he played a role of a container of those crazy masses, like to protect the West and the international order from the Russian psyche, from the Russian masses. Then I think after his swapping power with Medvedev in 2012, he started to play the role of a populist. That he said, no, I'm not going to be a container anymore. I'm going to be the amplifier of those massive expectations and ideas. He started to play a role of populist, and he continues. When he went into this war against Ukraine, he just continued playing the role of a populist, expressing the inner and the worst desires of the Russian psyche. He actually was the prophet, and he is, Putin is still the prophet of the Russian soul, if you want. The language which was given to the soul to express itself was given by the church. That is my argument, that the church managed to produce a mass ideology, not just elitist as Dugin's, but a mass ideology which would appeal, to masses, and which would allow Putin to capitalize on this ideology, on these feelings, on these desires of what they call the deep people, глубинный народ. And that's exactly the communicator between Putin as a populist and the masses of the Russians as the unconscious kind of expresser of desires, like a container of different desires, a container of desires that cannot be expressed by themselves. The mediator between the people and their desires and Putin, I believe, was the church and continues to be the church. The church actually managed to articulate a mass ideology and to deliver this ideology, to different corners of Russia and to make it working. The feature of ideology, which differentiates ideology, makes it different from any political idea, is that political ideas stay where they are. They are usually inactive. They remain inactive on the pages of the books. Ideologies, they drive millions to a purpose, to a goal. That's exactly the difference between Dugin and his ideas and ideology. Dugin produces ideas and they stay where they are. He's unable to produce an ideology. Ideology is produced by other, more skillful people who actually manage to drive millions. And they are quite successful in that.
Yeah, we have a comment here from Olena Maslukivska. Very interesting discussion. Thank you. I'm not from your field, but I do agree that Ukrainians need to play a role in deputinizing the Russian soul. And also, to continue, there is a question from Mykola Tupesiak. Tipusiak, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Will scientists be able to cope with this challenge without the help of church leaders and theologians? That goes back to what you said, that it's a task for intellectuals.
Well, I believe this is an interdisciplinary task, so everyone has to contribute to that. Because this phenomenon does not belong to only one field. It belongs to many fields, and we need to join our efforts. I mean, political scientists, sociologists of religion, the people from cultural studies, history of art, history of ideas, and theologians, only together, and philosophers, of course. So only together we could really deal with this monster.
I mean, I agree here, but I still have a bit of a problem here, and with the thing that, because I think that and it also goes back to what one of the points in your lecture you touched, when this example of Germans, those who kind of got rid of this idea. But for that, how I see that, for that, Germans faced the defeat in the war. So basically, the huge defeat, and made them to big degree to reevaluate their positions, to in a way probably even try to atone for it, so what I struggle with here is that, and what I actually partly meant by this point that we are outside, is that we are not those who are kind of, like, for the lack of the better word, guilty of this ideology. So the thing how for example, Russian Orthodox Church, or those who possess this messianic mentality, what they should do, or even whether they would be able to do anything without this defeat and this need for atonement, or understanding that they need an atonement.
Yeah. Well, I should remind us that the Germans had two defeats, one in the World War I and another one in World War II. And those were very different defeats. In the World War I, the defeat led to the revenge of Hitler. That was a defeat which was not facilitated by the international community. The Germans were left to deal with their wounds, to lick their wounds on their own. They were left, with reparations, very heavy burden of reparations, and they were left without intellectual and spiritual help. And they created this monster of the Third Reich. Right? Only after the defeat of the World War II, with the assistance of the international community, with a tremendous, huge intellectual effort, that we now probably cannot grasp how big it was, after the World War II, when best intellectuals worldwide contributed, to deal with the German ideology, including people like Isaiah Berlin, Hannah Arendt, and so forth, so many of them. In theology, it was Jürgen Moltmann, and so forth. It was a huge intellectual effort that helped Germans actually to deal differently with their own defeat in the World War II. Probably, well, this is just, of course, a speculation, that if they were not helped in this way properly, we would have had another revival of this same ideology out of this defeat. So dealing with the Russians, we really need to direct our effort, international effort, to help the Russians to overcome this sin that they've committed and they're still committing. So that's why we should not stand as outsiders. We need to act, we need to act through the different agents, including the church, including intellectuals, including the good Russians, whatever it is. So we need to use every instrument, just like the world dealt, with the German psyche after the World War II through its intellectuals, through people who did not collaborate. That's why, for example, this an example dear to me, they created a colony of the German artists in Los Angeles, where I stayed, and I actually had a chance to contemplate the remnants of this colony. So they really used every instrument to denazify the German psyche, as we need to use every instrument now to deputinize the Russian psyche.
You certainly make a persuasive argument for kind of trying our best. It's not that there remains a question if there should at least be some will on the side to change anything.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Without the Russian will, nothing will happen. We need to actually to inspire them and to urge them to make use of their will, to really make them thinking about what they have done, and to make them repenting, and to make them willing to be different people.
Yeah, but here the question, and I actually struggle with it myself, how you make people recognize what they've done if no one wants to recognize that they're basically done awful things and they are bad people, and it's a huge problem. I mean, it's easier to deny it.
But the example of Germany is very important in this regard. Well, those people were absolutely unwilling to recognize their faults after the World War I. And then they made a completely different choice after the World War II, and it saved them. This made Germany, well, Hitler essentially wanted to make Germany great again. That is the basis of his ideology. And he actually sold this idea to the German people. But what actually made Germany great again was the repentance after the World War II. And I believe in the case of Putinism, we are dealing with the same idea: make Russia great again. That is the quintessence of the Putin's effort to restore the grandeur of the Soviet Union, whatever, the Russian Empire. Make Russia great again, but actually he's destroying Russia. The only way to make Russia great again is to repent. It should be clearly communicated to the Russians, as it was communicated to the Germans, and it worked very well. That's why I believe the example we need to bring out of this depository, quite dusted depository of instruments of denazification of Germany. We need to update those instruments that were used after the World War II, and to use some of them in this situation of Russia.
Yeah, I have another question. Is probably not exactly about what we've been talking about, but it's relevant on some level. At least it comes often to my mind, and there have been discussions of that. And sometimes I've heard people actually cite Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem for that, and with this banality of evil. The thing is that with all these atrocities happening in Ukraine now, when we discover Izum, Bucha, and all this unimaginable things.
And I'm afraid we'll discover even more.
Even more, yeah. Some people start to wonder whether the evil should be given its own ontological stance.
Well, that would be a mistake. It would be a mistake, because evil is not ontological. That is the mistake the Russians have done, because they tend to ontologize evil. They believe that evil is concentrated as an essence, as a liquid kind of, air, things, stones in Ukraine, and they just want to eliminate it. So they fight an imagined ontological or ontologized evil, and this is a very wrong. That's one of the reasons, if you want, it's one of the intellectual reasons of this Russian crime, the ontologization of evil. We should not repeat this crime. We should not repeat this mistake, because if we consider that Russia is ontologically evil, we just walk in the steps of Russia, and it will lead us where it had led to had Russia to. That's why it's important to understand that they are they are people. There is nothing ontologically evil about them. It's they made wrong choices. They've been delusioned. They allowed themselves to be delusioned, and the way out of this deadlock where they are is repentance. Well, I'm talking as a Christian. I cannot, I cannot avoid it. It's repentance. It's reconsideration. It's repentance. The Greek word repentance, metanoia, means the change of mind. They need to change their mind, and it's an intellectual effort, a part of many other things. And that's why I stress that this necessity of global intellectuals to join their efforts in order to help the Russians to overcome themselves, to liberate themselves from those dangerous ideas that they've been engaged to.
Mm-hmm. And probably a bit in continuation of that, and a bit of what you've been, I think, one of the points that you've made, there is a next question, and it's again from Mykola Typusiak. I hope I read it correctly. Shouldn't we also think about how to make deputinization of the Ukrainian soul?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm thinking about this question more and more honestly. I like, this famous play by Evgeny Schwartz, To Kill the Dragon. The main point of this play is the moment you kill the dragon, you may turn into a dragon. Sometimes we become what we are fighting against. If we are fighting without caution. I envisage that after our victory, I don't have any doubt about our victory. Of course, it will be very hard to win, but it will happen. But after our victory, we will be exposed to the danger of adopting some features of the dragon that we will kill. That's why it's really important to watch our own souls, not to become like these Russian psyche. Also, yes, we are talking. I understand that this question also implies some kind of Russophilia, malorossiystvo, kind of the Ukrainians. That's another thing. Yes, it is present, and that's why so many Ukrainians collaborate with the occupants. That is a reality that we need to face. They do collaborate, and many people who are on free territories, unoccupied territories, are in sympathy, with the aggressor. This is also a reality, and to a great extent, they have the same sort of diseases of soul as their counterparts in Russia. Yeah, that's also a reality. So it's really a dangerous turf. It's like we're walking a minefield. We need to be really cautious not to trap into the same, not to walk into the same trap that the Russians found themselves. It's really dangerous to create a Ukrainian analogy of Putinism. Mm-hmm. Our force is to be a strong republic, a strong civil society, our togetherness, our civil values, that we value dignity. I believe that for us, it's like a beacon is the Maidan, essentially. The ideals of the Maidan that still can lead us, through this darkness, through these dangers. So if we are faithful to the ideals of the Maidan, that can help us to avoid all those traps on the minefield that the Russians have left.
Yeah, with these ideas of the Maidan, many research, and here I'm talking as a sociologist, shows that freedom, svoboda, is considered to be the main value for you. That a lot of Ukrainians choose, like around 80% choose freedom first and foremost.
At the same time, sociology shows that many Ukrainians want a strong hand. And after the Maidan, some politicians even try to play this kind of strong hand.
Yeah, and here it's an interesting puzzle here, how the strive for freedom combines with a strong hand. Exactly. And there is actually quite a lot of theories that it's kind of that Ukrainians want freedom, but they also wish for strong hand, but they do not live under strong hand.
This is quite a paradox.
There is this paradox, but what I actually wanted to ask, it's about a bit about. Do you think that the value in freedom is one of the core value, or having freedom as a core value is something that can kind of prevent or keep us from turning into Russian this type of soul?
It can. However, we should really, and this is another intellectual effort if you want, we really need to explore what it means, because it can mean many things, freedom. Like the Russians, they believe that they are fighting for freedom, for freedom of their country from the Western powers. That is their idea of sovereignty, which underlies this war. And for them, sovereignty is a freedom. It's a freedom of the country at the expense of freedom of individuals. So we need to decide what kind of freedom we stand for, because nowadays everyone stands for freedom. Even North Korea stands for freedom. of its sovereignty from the Americans, whatever. So we need really to define it, and it's a very serious intellectual work. And again, it's another opportunity for the intellectuals of Ukraine to work together.
Mm-hmm. And here's another comment or question from Olena Maslukivska. Yes, let's avoid developing further than anti-Russia. How can we mature the society to survive our victory? That's probably
It's a very big question. I don't have an answer to this question, honestly, but I'm sure that this is a very correct answer. It's really, well, we will enjoy our victory, but we will have also survive it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I'm trying to look through my comments, because if I kind of mentioned everything I wanted to mention, I think I more or less covered all the points. But I mean, I could still, I can still talk more, but I think we got more into just trying to be on a topic and not get too heavy-handed with that. Thank you very much for this discussion. I enjoyed it a lot, and for your very insightful comments. Thank you very much, and I thank all our audience. And all those who posted questions and comments, and see you then, everyone, in our next time. We will announce when it will be. And Atec Kirill, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me with you. All the best.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye. Take care.
If Ukraine does not survive, the United Nations will not survive. Have no illusions.